We learn in the Babylonian Chronicle, a list of actions of the Babylonian king recorded in cuneiform, that Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne of Babylon in 605, succeeding his father Nabopolassar. Shortly after, the next campaign year, Nebuchadnezzar conducted a campaign to the west. During this campaign, he came down the Mediterranean coast and arrived at the end of the campaign in the region of Philistia. He immediately set about destroying the cities of Philistia, prominently Ekron, and also in Kislev of 604, Ashkelon. We have some background on the campaign and the concern it was causing to the local kings of the region in an Aramaic papyrus that was written by a person named Adon, who was probably located in the city of Ekron in Philistia, who appealed to the Pharaoh of Egypt for support to resist the Babylonian campaign as it moved southward down the Mediterranean coast. The letter is written with a plea to send troops. This evidently came to no avail. Ekron was destroyed, possibly in 603. In the same year, or earlier part of that same campaign, in Kislev of 604, Nebuchadnezzar approached Ashkelon. Like the later Ekron, it had no recourse against the Babylonian army, and the city was devastated. It was razed to its foundations, and the excavations of the Leon Levy excavation run by Professor Larry Steger of Harvard University uncovered a massive destruction of the city. It was burned and completely destroyed, its fortifications utterly ruined, and the city burned to the ground. The evidence is thick and deep throughout the site of the 604 destruction, with pottery strewn along streets, in bazaars, in private homes. We also know that the Babylonians took some of these Philistine population and removed them in large numbers into Babylonia. We won't see them for some time until documents of the late 6th century and then into the 5th century, when we see some people in Ashkelon, from Ashkelon in Babylonia. In March of 597, the Babylonians returned to the region of Judah and laid siege to Jerusalem. We learn in 2 Kings chapter 24 the following. At that time, the troops of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon marched against Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon advanced against the city while his troops were besieging it. Thereupon King Jehoiachin of Judah, along with his mother and his courtiers, commanders, and officers, surrendered to the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He deported Jehoiachin to Babylon, and the king's wives and officers and the notables of the land were brought as exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon. And the king of Babylon appointed Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, changing his name to Zedekiah. This biblical narrative is reaffirmed with surprising accuracy in the so-called Babylonian Chronicle for the year 597, where we learn the following. For the 7th year, in the month Kislev, the king of Akkad, that is Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, mustered his army and marched to Hatti. He encamped against the city of Judah, and on the 2nd day of the month of Adar, he captured the city and seized its king. A king of his own choice he appointed in the city, and, taking the vast tribute, he brought it to Babylon. What happened to these individuals who were sent to Judah, from Judah to Babylon? What happened to the Ashkelonites and the other Philistines who, in the wake of the 604 and 603 destructions in Philistia, were carried away as captives to Babylonia? We learned some things and knew some things for many decades about the fate of a few of these individuals, and let me say something about that. In 2 Kings chapter 25, the last 4 verses of the book of Kings, we find out what happened to the elite members, including Jehoiachin, in Babylonia. The last 4 verses of Kings read as follows. In the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin of Judah, on the 27th day of the 12th month, King Evil Merodach, whose name in Babylonian is Amel Marduk, of Babylon, in the year he became king, took note of Jehoiakim of Judah and released him from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a throne above those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. His prison garments were removed, and Jehoiakim received regular rations by his favor for the rest of his life. A regular allotment of food was given him at the insistence of the king, an allotment for each day, all the days of his life. So Jehoiakim was emancipated from what seems to have been a more restrictive confinement to a more perhaps lenient one under the successor of Nebuchadnezzar, Amel Marduk. This took place later in the 560s. But we also know from Babylonian sources themselves that Jehoiakim and his compatriot from Ashkelon, Aga, were in fact put into confinement in Babylon and given rations in the immediate vicinity, probably, of the capital and its palaces. They were they were allowed certain amounts of rations, and each according to his status. What do we know from the Babylonian cuneiform tablets that come from the city itself about the fate of these kings? Well, we know from the so-called Weidner tablets, which were published already in 1939 by Ernst Weidner and which are in Berlin now, some information about captive kings from the West. So, for example, we hear in those texts that a certain group called Yahudaya, which will sound familiar to you if you know Hebrew or Aramaic, the Judeans, were present in the vicinity of Babylon. We know, too, from the same text that Jehoiakim and his sons, together with several other Judeans, received rations from the crown. We know that the Babylonians referred to the country from which they came as Mat, or land, of Yahudu, Judah. But we also know, for example, that the Ashkelonites were located in the vicinity of Babylon and the palaces. So, for example, Aga and his two sons, he was the king and his sons were the crown princes, were located in Babylon. They are said to come from Mat, or land, of Ishkiluna, Ashkelon. And they were each given a ration of 1 sila, a Babylonian measure, of grain. But other Ashkelonites were there too, mariners, leaders of the community, and also singers in the court. So the Babylonians took elite members of the Western courts and their retainers and assistants, housing them in the vicinity of the city and providing them rations. These texts, as I say, were known since 1939. After that reference in the Weidner tablets, we have a few stray references in contracts and other miscellaneous cuneiform Babylonian documents mentioning from one time to another an occasional Judean or another member of an elite or even just a regular person from the West in occasional contracts and documents. It's not until we reach almost 150 years later, in the end of the 5th century BCE, that we begin to learn more from cuneiform documents about the fate of these Westerners. In the so-called Marashu archive, a collection of documents from a business family near the city of Nippur, southeast of Babylon, we begin to learn once again that these Judeans who had been sent to the land of Babylon are present and active in administrative contexts, economic contexts, farming contexts. But what happened between the time of 597 and then 586, when Judah was finally destroyed, and this time of the Marashu archives in the late 5th century BCE? This region, this period of time, was known for the most part as a kind of dark age. Stray references, but no more. The only other information we had, of course, was from the Bible. This is now beginning to change slowly. In a new collection of texts that were obtained in the antiquities market, we find out that Judeans were settled in the vicinity of Nippur immediately upon their arrival and as deportees from Judah. So too were others from other countries, and they were put together in ethnic, homogeneous neighborhoods and settlements in the vicinity of the Babylonian hinterland, probably with the intention of resuscitating the economies of these relatively outlying areas of Babylonia. So we know twin towns, as the phenomenon has sometimes been called, whereby people from the old homeland town in their native country were settled in a new town in Babylonia, and it was given the same name. We know of a town of the Ashkelonites, a town of Gaza, a town of Tyre, a town of Narab, a town of Gezer, and also, and perhaps now most interestingly, Judahville, or Al-Yehudu, the city of Judah, a settlement evidently populated largely by Judeans in the vicinity of Nippur. We have an increasing number of documents available to us from this so-called Al-Yehudu, or the city of Judah, and other local towns in the vicinity. Only a few of them have so far been published, but they give us a tantalizing view of how Judeans were living their lives in Babylonia after 586. How were the Judeans then living their lives in Babylonia after 582? These cuneiform texts from the vicinity of Al-Yehudu, either in the city or nearby, begin to give us a glimpse into how they lived their lives. The published examples of these texts show us, for example, marriage contracts, West Semites, people from the vicinity of Judah and elsewhere, marrying in the local context. We learn of their business transactions, and we learn of, for example, an inheritance division in which, after the death of a father, the property owned by him is divided up among his several sons. What else do we know of these Judeans in Babylonia from these new cuneiform tablets? We learn, for example, that they were organized according to a certain kind of Babylonian association, or a chatru. And in the chatru, local officials, local Judeans, functioned as officials on behalf of the Babylonian crown to collect taxes, to remit produce, and so forth. So we have Judeans functioning in roles that we've known from Babylonian economic contexts for some while. For example, as a Shushanu or as a Deku. This is a term for a tax collector or a summoner. So these Judeans are collecting the taxes of their local brethren and co-workers and remitting them as payment for obligations to the crown. How do we know they're Judeans? The texts are written in Babylonian. Well, the texts describe the people by name, and we learn that they have typically West Semitic names. So, for example, you have a name like Avdayahu, which in Hebrew would be Ovadia or Obadiah. The first element is Eved, or servant, and the second element, Yahu, is of course the name for the God of Israel. That element, often in these texts, is preceded by the sign Babylonian scribes use to mark a character as a god. So the scribes in cuneiform knew that their West Semitic population from Judah had names that included the divine name Yud-He-Vav. So they fulfilled these various roles, and we know that they're Judeans because of their names and their lists of affiliation. One father with a name like Ovadia will be the son of another man whose name was Baruch Yama. In other words, Berechia, or the like. So these Judeans are retaining their ethnic, if you wish, self-consciousness by giving their children names that are likewise Judean and show filiation in the tradition and allegiance to the God of Judah. Not all, however, followed the same patterns. Some gave their children local Mesopotamian names, as immigrant communities are apt to do through time. So sometimes we'll find a father who is a Judean and a son who has an Akkadian name, or even sometimes vice versa, a father with an Akkadian name who has a son with a Judean name. So as far as we know then from these texts, the Judeans would show the allegiance to their origins, to their perhaps religious practices, if we can judge from their names. And yet we also find out from the texts that the Judeans were able to insinuate themselves, or to use anthropological terms, they were able to acculturate in Babylonia. Their marriage contracts, for example, were written out according to the Babylonian style and procedures. The amounts paid in terms of dowries and the penalties for a breach of contract were characteristic of the Babylonian context. In the inheritance division, again, it was Akkadian or Mesopotamian scribes who were notarizing the document and making legal the inheritance to subsequent generations. And as I say, some people were adopting Babylonian names. So it's not a matter simply of the Judeans remaining in their little enclave and having nothing to do with the wider Akkadian or Mesopotamian world. At some level, they're beginning to accommodate themselves to this world. This led to tensions, probably, between those who saw this as utterly unacceptable and those who saw it as completely normal. The usual kinds of tensions we might see in immigrant communities in other contexts, throughout time and historical periods. Let me offer one example of one of the Babylonian texts that was written on behalf of Judeans who were dividing up the property of their father in inheritance. This is the translation offered by Kathleen Abraham in her initial publication of the text, partially restored by her. These are the slaves, a share in the paternal estate which Neriah, or Neriyahu, and Yahuazah, the sons of Ahikam, and Haggai, Yahu-Izri, and Yahushu, 3 other sons of Ahikam, have divided among them. The slave Naniah is the inheritance share of Neriah and Yahuazah. Shachidyahu, the slave, and 8 barrels of the inheritance go to the other 3 sons, Haggai, Yahu-Izri, and Yahushu. While they split, here I'm just reading the partially broken text, they split up the rest of the household utensils, or goods, among them. The text continues a little later. The obligation which is outstanding against their father, Ahikam, they will pay off jointly. The text then is witnessed by a whole series of notaries. The first several are local Mesopotamian individuals with Akkadian names, and then some Judeans who have classically Yahwistic names at the end. The text was written, we learn, in the 18th year of King Darius in the city of Al-Yehudu, the city of Judah. And each one of the 5 participants in this inheritance division gets a copy of the contract. So we can see several interesting things from this text. They've acculturated very well. They've achieved a certain measure of wealth and property, which can be divided among the sons. They have slaves. And in fact, one of the slaves, Shachidyahu, has a name that's Yahwistic, which means that some Judeans had slaves who were themselves Judeans in Babylon. So by the end of the 6th century then, we can see that there's a huge process of bringing these Judeans into the sphere of Babylonian life and culture. This, of course, though, wasn't entirely satisfactory to everybody. And so if we think only from the biblical point of view, we can imagine that certain people will have had massive disagreements with persons who acculturated in this way to the Babylonian environment. So if one thinks, for example, of the so-called second Isaiah, who produced, at the very least, chapters 40 to 55 of the book of Isaiah, we find steady polemics against Babylonian religious practices, Babylonian mantic or divinatory practices, Babylonian intellectual conceits. And this is something that the second Isaiah finds, of course, objectionable and to be resisted. So, for example, in chapter 44 of the book of Isaiah, we have a very lengthy screed against the building of idols in the practice of Babylonian religion, in which the religious practitioners in Babylonia are made to seem ridiculous. For example, in 44 verse 9, we read, "The makers of idols all work to no purpose, and the things they treasure can do no good. As they themselves can testify, they neither look," that is the idols, "they neither look nor think, and so they, the makers, will be shamed. They mock them for making idols out of wood or metal, which are, of course, mute and useless." The second Isaiah instead argues that, of course, it's the God of Israel who is the living God, who decides the fate of nations. but one can imagine that this will have been a very difficult argument for some Judeans to appreciate in the context of Babylonia, where they were subjugated by the Babylonian authorities, and where they lived under the claims of Babylonian kings who worked, as they understood it, in the service of their own god Marduk to subjugate foreign populations. In addition to this mocking language about idols in 2nd Isaiah, we also find that the 2nd Isaiah goes farther. He even says that their entire intellectual apparatus is a hoax or built on stupidity. So in chapter 47, he mocks Lady Babylon, personified, and says, "Sit in silence," in verse 5. "Retire into darkness, O fair maiden Chaldea," name for Babylon. "Nevermore will they call you mistress of kingdoms." And in verse 12, it says, "Stand up with your spells and your many enchantments on which you labored since your youth. Perhaps you'll be able to profit. Perhaps you'll find strength." Mocking rhetorical assertions, of course. And in verse 13, "You're helpless, despite all your art. Let them stand up and help you now, the scanners of heaven, the stargazers, who announce month by month whatever will come upon you." So you can see that the 2nd Isaiah had a very powerful animus against Babylon and its pretensions and cultic practices. This long polemic in the 2nd Isaiah against Babylon was probably given near the time when the end of the Babylonian kingdom could be foreseen by the prophet in anticipation of the rise of Cyrus the Great of Persia, who would, of course, in 539, put an end to the native Babylonian rule in their capital.